Before I get along too far here, if I could get an idea of, for all of you here, how many of you have actually set up Microsoft's VDI solution, have kind of fiddled with it yet at this point? Handful of you have. How many of you are using things like Microsoft Terminal services or have used it at some point in time? A lot more of you are familiar with it. And how about Hyper-V? Okay, so if you've done Hyper-V, if you've done anything regarding Microsoft Remote Desktop Services, or what used to be called Terminal Services, is that basically is the foundation of VDI. And there's a number of different ways that VDI is implemented. I'll talk about that today. In my free time, I write books on the technologies. I was on the early adopter for Microsoft, and we worked on a book, Windows Server 2008 R2. I'm one of those rare speakers here at TechEd that I am not a Microsoft employee, nor am I here to sell you anything as a vendor. I'm actually here to share with you best practices, tips and tricks, and some technologies, and I'll throw that information out to you. What I have to be able to share with you today is around the whole Microsoft VDI space, and I'll kind of zip through. I got some demos that I'll cover. And at the end, we'll go through and take questions at that point. So I'm going to give you a quick background on really the VDI and the RemoteFX space for those of you who didn't raise your hand or not familiar with Microsoft has. VDI is the desktop, virtual desktop infrastructure. RemoteFX was added in Windows 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 that actually provides video caching and high-resolution, high-definition video. So if you're really looking to be able to do full-motion video in effectively a guest session, is that this is a technology that has been built into Service Pack 1 that provides you to drive that level of technology for high performance. I'll talk about behind the scenes, what's actually involved in setting up one of these VDI things. I've already, before the session started, a handful of you have been asking me questions, which I'll be glad to go through and repeat some of those questions, as well as share with you some of those best practices so that you can actually make this thing work a little bit better. There's a lot of questions that I quite frequently come up with. RDS versus VDI. Now, remote desktop is the typical terminal services, Citrix type of mode. VDI gets into the dedicated guest session. Toward the end, I'll talk about some best practices and exactly what we found is some organizations go down the VDI path. Some organizations go down the RDS path. I'll also talk about third-party products. When do you actually go out and buy maybe a Citrix plugin? Or when do you go out and buy other solutions to be able to plug into this, and when are they necessary, and when organizations have found you could do native out of the box with what Microsoft provides. And then I'll talk about some of the integration pieces. So I kind of zip on through those different areas. So quick background on Microsoft VDI and RemoteFX. So VDI stands for Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, and effectively is the ability for you to run a desktop operating system on a system that your remote users could get access to. Now, when you think about something like RDS, Remote Desktop Terminal Services, you set up a Windows server, your users use the remote desktop client, and they remotely access a guest session, but it's one-to-many. You have effectively one copy of Microsoft Word, you have multiple people connecting to it, you either like that version of Word or you don't. It either works on a server or it doesn't. It basically is a one-to-many. You don't have many options in the way of modifications to the application. Whereas VDI, on the other hand, is not actually running on a server. It's running as a Hyper-V guest session. So effectively, think of it from the basis that if you had a Hyper-V host and you're running a bunch of Hyper-V guest sessions, they happen to be maybe Windows 7, 32-bit or 64-bit, and when your users remotely come into those sessions, they're effectively terminal serving into a guest session that's running Windows 7. And so the advantage, or it could actually be XP too. So we've gone through to that basis where we've had organizations that have had a need to be able to have very specialized accounting software that only runs on XP. Their organization went to Windows 7. How do you give the users access to a Windows XP guest session and effectively run it as a VDI guest session? Users come in, they can run a 32-bit version of Windows XP as basically a Hyper-V guest session. And so there's a lot, as you start thinking through that, it's like, okay, now if I have the ability of running an XP or Windows 7 guest session within Hyper-V, that's great, but do I have to give those users IP addresses and direct connections to each one of the systems? And that's what I'll talk about, the connectivity. So that's the VDI piece. Effectively, you're remoting into a Hyper-V guest session. The RemoteFX, as I mentioned, it is a add-in to Windows 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 that came out in, January, February this year, and effectively allows you to run full motion video, Flash, Silverlight, graphical content. And if you've ever used terminal services in the past and you try to run any kind of high motion video, it's really grainy, jerky, it's not really that great of experience. The other thing that you find when you start trying to do video is that if you put enough hardware and you have a high enough pipe, you can actually get full motion video for one person. Now, if you're trying to now have 10, 20, 30 people trying to access full motion video, you can bring a server to its knees. And so what Microsoft is doing is they're using a graphical processor to offload the processing of the graphics. And again, I'll get a little bit more in depth on this thing, but I just kind of want to set the tone as to get an idea of what it is and where this stuff fits in. So let me go through and switch over to my demo system, since I spent all this time setting up demos and configurations and stuff like that, and show you effectively the remote experience. And so if you had a user that was running, and I have two different users that I have set up here. I have a user called Jason. Oops. Oh. Company, ABC. Helps if I get the right domain name. Okay, so Jason, you'll notice here is logging in, and he's running a Windows 2008 R2 guest session. So he is actually directing his guest session to a traditional terminal server or remote desktop server. So anything that's on here, these applications are all Word or Excel running on a server. I can put 50, 100, 150 users on this terminal server guest session remotely coming in. One server, multiple guest sessions. So that's basically a user logging in and redirecting out to the terminal server. I'm now going to log into the same IP address with a different user. And this time I remember what the domain name was. And I have a user, Mike. And Mike is now going to go into that exact same IP address for logging in, but he's going to end up in a Windows 7 guest session. And so this is, again, it forks at the terminal server redirector. One user happens to go to terminal server. One user happens to go to Windows 7 as a guest session as a client system. So basic functionality of where this thing fits in. And again, I'll get a lot more in depth as to how this stuff works and how to make it work and what have you, but just kind of the basic functions. I'll show you RemoteFX in a bit here. So behind the scenes and how all this stuff works and what are all the different technologies that are involved. So just from a terminology standpoint, I'm going to use the terminal server name quite frequently, but marketing will tell you that it's now called Remote Desktop. It actually changed back with the Windows 2008 product where they called it Terminal Services, and then in Windows 2008, 2008 R2, 2008 R2 SP1, they went through and they call it Remote Desktop Services, and then some of the different modes, RD Session Hosts, RD Connection Broker, RD Licensing Server, RD Gateway, Web Access, and Virtualization Host. So they just rebranded everything as a Remote Desktop. The new thing, effectively, in this whole VDI is that RD Virtualization Host that basically becomes a Hyper-V server that is joined to this environment. So to kind of give you an idea of what my environment here looks like is that I'm running, effectively, a domain controller. I have my redirector, which is my connection broker. I have my remote desktop server, and then I have VDI guests. And this whole host itself, the laptop that I'm working on right now, is actually a Hyper-V server that is being redirected. So any of these guest sessions that I'm running are running on a Hyper-V. So I effectively have Hyper-V, I have remote desktop services, and this redirector is a thing that's going to basically point it to either the VDI guest session or the RDS guest session. From the remote desktop services in the VDI piece. So you noticed here that I have a single point. I'm using an IP address, but I can give it a DNS name. But I have a single point of communications that all the traffic goes in to this one connection broker that redirects this session. So it's a unified administration, unified user experience. So I don't have to basically say, you're a VDI user, you have to use this IP address, and you're a terminal server user or RDS user, and you have to use a different address. I can also switch at any point. So I can have somebody that's using a traditional remote desktop, and then if all of a sudden their needs change, and I'm now being told, yes, they have a specialized software program, I don't have to tell them to change software programs or IP addresses. I just basically go through, make a change on the back end. They now redirect out to their own dedicated Windows XP or Windows 7 guest session on the system. So I could go through and dedicate the VDI guest sessions to the systems. Now, for those VDI guest sessions, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, there's this concept of pooled versus personal guest session. A personal guest session is dedicated to a specific user each and every time. A pooled guest session is one where you have a pool of these VDI sessions, and a person hits any one of many of these guest sessions. And the advantage to that is, say, for example, for personal, It's about as one-to-one as they get because the user always logs into that VDI guest session. Nobody else ever uses that guest session. If the person doesn't use it for a month, nobody uses that guest session. It's sitting there. Whereas a pool, I might have 100 guest sessions, and I may only use, for example, I may have 200 people accessing it, but only 100 at a time. And so in that case there, I can pool them, people can share them. We do that quite frequently for call centers. So we might have a call center that's around the clock that half the shift is doing one side of the world, and the other side of the shift is using the other side of the world, and I'm able to use a limited number of guest sessions for twice or 3 times the number of sessions that are out there. When you do the VDI, you're going to get a richer experience because the person is one-to-one. Even if you do this pooled, where I have 200 people sharing 100 guest sessions, while that person is using the guest session, they're getting a full experience of what Windows XP or Windows 7 is giving you. Is out any of the graphics, screensavers, applications that are running are dedicated to that system. And I'm obviously going to get better compatibility with the Windows 7 guest session than I am typically going to get with the Windows 2008 terminal server session. Again, I could use a 32-bit client, which sometimes is the drawing board of where people can't go to Windows 7, 64-bit, but here's a way I can use a 32-bit guest session or, like I said, an XP guest session. So Microsoft VDI and how it works, I talked about this whole idea is that I have this Hyper-V host that's running, and the user gets access, and they launch a guest session. So I'm not going to kind of beat that one up multiple times. So for the console start and a VDI guest session, is that there's 2 ways that I can go through and set up this VDI guest session. Is one, I can actually have it running continuously. So in this case here, I have a VDI guest session that is already running. If I have a user, like an example, Mike is accessing that system. Mike is actually going to go into that guest session, and he's going to launch that Windows 7 guest. But I could also go through and keep these sessions offline. So say, for example, I have a bunch of guest sessions that I don't want running all the time. They don't use it, and they only use it once or twice a month kind of thing. Is I can go through, and I have a user here that I think I called Rich. Let me double check. And what you'll notice here, what you'll notice on the VDI2 guest session here, it's currently off, meaning that it's not powered on. If I did this right. Now you'll notice that it started that guest session. The user's going to get this thing as waking the virtual machine. And so what you could do by policy, and I'll show you kind of how you turn these things automatically off every day, but you can actually set it up so that the users use it by day. It shuts them down automatically every single night, and then the next time the person accesses it, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, it automatically turns on. Now, it does take a little bit longer. You notice when Mike logged in, his guest session was already running. He had immediate access to that VDI guest session. In this case here, it's just like any other Hyper-V guest. It's going to take a good 10, 20 seconds for that guest session to come up, and now Rich has his VDI guest session running Windows 7. So the auto start capability really just gives you the ability of going through and starting a guest session offline. And again, I'll show you a script that we have available that gives you the ability of going through and shutting down these guest sessions. And again, a bit based on really how you set up your VDI, in order for you to be able to achieve those cost savings, is that you don't want all these servers running all these guest sessions that are idle. And so if I had the ability of going through and consolidating guest sessions, keeping them powered off, keeping the temperature, the processing power of these systems lower, I can actually lower my costs. So that's the whole idea, and if you can go through and set these things to auto start, it does decrease the cost and time to operate, but the boot up time takes a little bit longer. I talked about this virtual versus the pooled, and just kind of show you again, the pooled is a group of, call it 100 sessions for 200 users around the clock, whereas that personal virtual desktop, it's the same user's desktop every single time they log in and they log out. So the question that I get, when do I use RDS and when do I use VDI? For those of you who attended the keynote this morning, Robert Robbie talked about bank that is using VDI for 100,000 users. And the question becomes, from a VDI perspective, do you get 100,000 guest sessions using VDI? Do you use 100,000 guest sessions for remote desktop services? And this is really where the best practices come into place as to what do you need? And at the end of the day, remote desktop services, or RDS, the traditional terminal server, is cheaper than VDI. And so if I can do in RDS what I need to be able to do in my business, it is going to be cheaper. And the reason why it's cheaper is that in a terminal services or an RDS session, is that frequently we can push upwards 150 to 250 simultaneous users on a single server. With VDI, we typically are pushing maybe 30 to 50 on a single server. And again, VDI at 30 to 50 guest sessions per server, primarily because each one of these systems are running a full-blown copy of Windows 7 or Windows XP. All the processing capabilities of effectively a Hyper-V guest session is that you think about it, you won't necessarily put more than 15, 20 Hyper-V servers running on guest sessions on a Hyper-V server. VDI, I can push it a little more because a lot of times I can get a 1 gig or a gig and a half memory space per VDI guest. But still, terminal services, I can get 150 to 200 user density. So higher ratio, better session capabilities. Operating system gets down to really that decision is that does the application that I'm running support terminal services or RDS? And a lot of times you'll find some applications, they don't like the 64-bit that you put on a terminal server. A lot of times the applications require very dedicated guest session configurations that you can't do this 200 to 1 type of configuration. At that point, VDI is the way to be able to go. But anytime we go through it, we always start with the premise that I'm going to try to do with RDS. And we will do everything we can to be able to configure it to be able to do RDS, because if I do one-to-many, it's going to be a whole lot cheaper for the organization and configurations. I'll talk about some other scenarios in this thing. The other thing that you could do with remote desktop services or RDS is this thing called Remote App. Remote App gives you the ability of going through and publishing just an application icon. So up until now, terminal services, we've always done terminal services where you basically launch a guest session, you get the start button, and then you can launch Word and Excel and all those applications. And what Microsoft included, starting with Windows 2008 server, is the ability for you to just basically publish an icon, Outlook icon, Excel icon, Word icon. So when the person double-clicks on the Word icon, it actually launches a terminal server session. The user actually never knows it. And what we've done for a handful of organizations is we've gone through and set this up so that the user is using just a very simple 512 meg basic system or terminal. They see all these little icons, and they double-click, and what they don't know is that Office is not installed on that laptop or that desktop. It goes out to one of these remote desktop servers, and in Remote App, gives them Word and Excel and Adobe Acrobat and their accounting software, what have you. And you can even intermix this in the sense that maybe I want to be able to put Office on the desktop, but maybe there's an accounting software or a CRM application or something that's specialized that I want to just put that icon on a desktop. So I could do that with a remote desktop. I can't do that with VDI because, again, VDI is really intended that you're basically going to run everything on this guest session. So this is a nice kind of in-between way of I could do application publishing and have the ability to have the applications available without going through and having the desktops configured with a full-blown desktop application. And that's one way that we've been able to also handle application compatibility, is that if I can't necessarily run it on a Windows 7 system on a rollout, maybe I can build it in a terminal server, put an icon on a person's desktop, and they can run that little application in an icon. The other thing that we can do with remote desktop services is this remote web access. And this is RD web access, and in the bottom left-hand side, you'll see basically a web screen. It's completely configurable. We've done this as a SharePoint web part for many implementations. We've gone through and set this up so that you have these web pages that the user does Outlook web access to see their email. And then with that, it's also a little frame that gives them the ability to launch Word or Excel or their ERP application or the accounting software. That's all basically just an icon sitting off of a web browser. And so in order for us to be able to do that, I use the session host, which is basically my terminal server in my environment. I have a web access server, which is kind of in the Exchange world, the front end versus the back end. So the remote desktop server becomes the back end, and this web application, web app server becomes the front end. And that becomes just basically the front component that the user is able to hit. Now, when I talk about application compatibility, I said we always try to make it work with RDS. There's a couple of things that Microsoft has included, again, in Windows 2008, 2008 R2, and SP1, that sometimes helps us where we weren't able to go through and run applications in the past. One way is what they call IP virtualization modes. One of the challenges that you used to have with terminal services is that every single user used the same IP address. So if you had a terminal server that had an IP address, and you had 10, 50, 100 people trying to access that terminal server, everybody came in as if they were the same IP address. So if you're doing anything around 3270 emulation, if you're doing anything around remote access terminal networking, where it's looking at an IP address, a lot of times web-based applications look at the IP address and say, welcome, I see who you are, you're coming from this IP address. But if everybody was coming from the same IP address in the traditional terminal server, you weren't able to run these applications. What Microsoft included as this IP virtualization mode is the ability for you to actually do DHCP for every guest session of a person logging into remote desktop services. So now when the person logs in, and you may have 200 people accessing this one terminal server, each user can actually get their own IP address. So if you have an application that requires unique IP addresses, that's one way to be able to address that. The other thing that we've been able to find is around performance. People say, well, we want to go VDI because these users are slamming the server, and the first person that goes in and starts running this graphical software is actually taking up all the performance. And the second thing that they've added to 2008 and thereafter for server is this fair share CPU scheduling, which is the ability for the system to actually go through and do balancing and limitation, throttling effectively of the guest session. So even if you had a user that went in and they were the only person in a terminal server system and they get 100% of the performance, and all of a sudden 20, 50, 100 people get access to that system, it goes out and rebalances out the user. Now the user will complain and say, man, this morning I had full performance, and then all of a sudden at 8 o'clock it started slowing down. It's like, yeah, because now other people came in and started to work. So get in earlier in the day and you can access the system. But it does provide you with better balancing. Again, those are two ways that we try to go down the path of making RDS work, so that way I can get 150 or 200 to 1, and I don't have to go down to VDI. But for VDI, and I kind of shared with you already some of the reasons that we go to VDI, dedicated to guest session per system. If you need a 32-bit guest session, and there's a lot of old applications out there that still need 32-bit, VDI has been that good intermediary where I can run a copy of XP, or I can run a copy of Windows 7 in 32-bit for that specific application. Maybe if there's 10 people in the accounting department that need a 32-bit guest session, but everybody else can go to Windows 7 64-bit on their desktop, why hold the whole company up to go into Windows 7 for those 10 people? So we can go through and set up a VDI server and host them. If a person really needs a C drive that's private, C drive private is two things. One is a security reason, one is an application reason. If you have a lot of really old applications that write those INI files or something on the C drive, really those squirrely applications, then if you had the whole terminal server remote desktop, I can't necessarily have everybody write to a C drive that's writing an actual file that might be required. Now there's tricks around that, so don't give up. Just because the application uses an INI file, you can still use terminal services. There's several tricks I'll talk about a little bit later, and I post in my blog post, but don't ever let an INI file go through and prevent you from going through and using terminal services or remote desktop services, is that you can actually go through and redirect those INI files by simple tricks within terminal services. But it's some of those applications that you can't trick. Again, handful of them out there that's existing. And as I mentioned, the second reason around the private C drive is for security purposes. If you have people that potentially will write stuff to the C drive or potentially write secured information, you may want to dedicate a guest session. And again, you can lock down security, you can set permissions, you can do a lot of things, but there still comes a point where you might run into a situation where somebody says, I absolutely need a dedicated C drive. And then dedicated performance. If I can't do it through the throttling capabilities, I'll go through and do it through the configuration pieces through VDI. So integrating traditional RDS and VDI, and this is really kind of that best of both, is that again, I'm using the same IP address, same name, and it forks, whether it's Jason going off to his dedicated to a terminal server or Mike going off to a VDI session, one gateway, multiple different experiences where I can use remote desktop, I can use pooled, and I can use personal virtual desktops. So that's the directions of sharing of the information. In the way of technologies that are behind the scenes on this whole thing, is the connection broker is the key piece that does the forking. That's the part that is going to basically take the IP address and move it either to the personal desktop, pooled desktop, or to the terminal server system. Microsoft has this thing called this remote desktop gateway. One of the biggest challenges that has been available in terminal services is it uses a proprietary protocol. It uses the RDP protocol, port 3389, and the port 3389 many times is blocked when a person is on the back end of a firewall. A lot of times I find when I'm in internet cafes, I'm at a hotel, is it won't allow me to get to terminal services using port 3389. Microsoft also included within there this remote desktop gateway, which provides me port 443 access to this gateway. So now I could be sitting at an internet cafe, port 443, which is the same thing that HTTPS uses for secured web access, hits that gateway. That gateway then communicates with my connection broker at port 3389 and gives me access to my terminal services or my VDI guest sessions. So we only use the gateway. It's basically overhead. If I can do without it, I'll do without the gateway. But in those situations where, and so if you're in a corporate environment where you're trying to be able to have all your corporate users access terminal services or VDI, don't put a gateway in place. It just becomes overhead in the environment. There's no reason why you wouldn't pass 3389 from an internal network to an internal server farm. But if you have people that are roaming users and that they're sitting in internet cafes, that gateway 9 times out of 10 will solve the solution where the person's somewhere and they need to get access to terminal server and port 3389 is blocked. You don't need the connection broker either if all you're doing is trying to get access to a terminal server. The connection broker is the thing that's going to go through and route you between whether it's a VDI guest session or a terminal server guest session. But just a handful of different roles that put it into the process. Oh, one of the questions that somebody did ask in a previous session that I did was when I set this thing up, how many guest sessions do I need at a minimum? And so the minimum number of guest sessions to be able to make this work, and of course we always cheat when we're in the lab, and so you try to stuff as much as you can into a single system. But if you're going to play with remote desktop services, your minimum configuration is 3. You need to have a connection broker, which is a dedicated connection broker. You need to have a remote desktop services, or the RDS server, as a dedicated system. And then you need to have your terminal server host, which are your virtualization host, which is your Hyper-V host. And if you're doing VDI, then you need this RDS redirector, kind of, again, showing you my configuration at a minimum that I need on this configuration. I need Active Directory. So I guess I need 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I need 4 at a minimum in that basis. The redirector becomes effectively the connection broker that does the routing of the information. Remote desktop services is my remote desktop server. That's a session host, basically the old style terminal server. And this whole thing is my Hyper-V system. So 3 systems at a minimum, 4 if you're going to go through and include Active Directory inside the place. If you try to combine the connection broker and the RDS server together, what will happen is that you will never get to a VDI guest session. Because what happens is your connection broker will try to route it out to what they call the redirector. The redirector bounces it back to the connection broker. The connection broker routes that back to the redirector. And all of a sudden, you're sitting there and it's saying, starting. And you're just like, doesn't work. Never starts because it's always bouncing back and forth between these two. When you split them apart, connection broker, the RDS server, it hits the connection broker redirects it out to the redirector server, which now gives you a VDI guest session or RDS guest session. So just kind of those tricks is when you're fiddling with this thing, don't cheat in how many guest sessions that you put into place, because otherwise you'll find it won't work. Switch back to my demo system. So in Active Directory, and how do I redirect this stuff? So going into my Active Directory system, the way that you do the routing of this is when you install Windows 2008, R2 or higher, typically if you're going to be doing the VDI piece, what you'll find is that in the guest session space is that there's this personal virtual desktop tab that shows up. So you got the typical name and address and account information and profile and stuff. But this new personal virtual desktop shows up. This is where I put in effectively the server that it's going to hit. So Jason goes to that server, Mike, and his personal virtual desktop goes to VDI 1. So that's one of the Windows 7 guest sessions. And in Rich, he also has his personal virtual desktop, and he's VDI 2. And so what you'll see here is this is where I go through and specify which VDI guest session do I want these people to go to. Or in the case of Chris, who goes nowhere, effectively, if he doesn't have a VDI personal session, he's going to route out to just the generic terminal server out to the system. So I can basically, if I want to be able to have Chris go to a different virtual session, if I had VDI3.company123.org, I could basically put it in. I don't have a VDI3 session, but that's where I would put it. Otherwise, if I leave that blank, he's going to go out to the generic terminal server for one-to-many. So that's just basically where you go through and make the configuration changes for the redirection and the routing. I'm sorry? Can you have both? No, you can't be both a VDI and an RDS person, because otherwise it's not going to know. But you can switch back and forth. And so you can actually switch it so that way, if the person does a particular report at the end of the month, you can go through and switch it so that way on the last day of the month, you can make that change. It is a configuration change that we've been able to script. So there was a scenario where we had an organization at the end of every month, the accounting manager needed to run a specific application. And so on the 29th of every month, we went through and made a configuration change just through a PowerShell script. And so you can actually go through and switch it, but you can't switch it on the fly. You have to basically run a script or go into the 80 users and computers and make the change. All right, implementing RemoteFX. So the RemoteFX piece is the product that goes through and does high-resolution video. And there's two things that Microsoft added in 2008 R2 Service Pack 1. One is dynamic memory, and one is RemoteFX. Dynamic memory, they'll talk about it in the Hyper-V guest session. I'm not going to cover it in detail at all. But effectively, dynamic memory in a Hyper-V server, if you've ever configured a Hyper-V server, say, for example, has 16 gigs of RAM, is that you know you can do no more than 4 gigabyte guest sessions. And probably at that is you probably only do 3 4 gigabyte guest sessions in a 16 gig server, because otherwise you run out of memory and you still need memory for the core host server. What dynamic memory does in Service Pack 1 is it allows you to specify a range. I could say I want anywhere from 2 to 4 gig on each one of these guest sessions, or maybe 2 to 4 gig, 1 gig to 8 gig, and 1 gig to 8 gig. And what it does is it boots up, and what it does is it goes out and scales the amount of memory that the system actually uses. So the system's only using, say, 3 gig. Even though I configured it to support up to 4 or 8 gigs of RAM, it's not going to use all 8 gig just because. It actually is only going to use what it's needing. So you're able to go through and overcommit the memory. So I'm able to go through and say I want 5 4 gig sessions in a system that only has 16 gigs of RAM, knowing that, hoping that, you don't overcommit that memory and it doesn't exceed the memory. We've been able to use things like System Center Operations Manager to actually monitor these systems. So that way, if for some reason a guest session really starts using that 8 gigs of RAM, we then use live migration to basically move that guest session over to another system with more resources. So there's some tricks to that. But let me focus on the thing that I'm here to talk about, which is RemoteFX. RemoteFX is something also that they added into Windows 2008 R2 Service Pack 1. And effectively what it does is that it gives you the ability of using a full rich Windows experience for graphics. It accelerates the ability for you to run Silverlight, Flash, or any graphical software on the system itself. High fidelity user experience and blah, 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 a bunch of other stuff that it does. But mostly it's a graphical processing. And the way that it does it is that normally when you're trying to run a graphical software on a server, is that you're trying to do a full motion video or Silverlight or something, is it's using the CPU on that system. Now, if you only have 4 core or 8 core or 16 core on a system, and you're trying to do all these high resolution graphics processing, is that it's really beating up on the CPU that you're already stretching 100 to 1 or 150 to 1. And so the minute that somebody tries to do full motion video on a system that already has 100 users in terminal server mode, is that it brings the server to its knees. What this does is you add a GPU, a graphical processor unit. A GPU is the same card that you go out and buy for your gaming. So if you want to be able to do Call of Duty, you want to be able to go through and run Halo on a PC, and you go out and buy one of those $1,000, $1,500 graphical processor boards, is that you put one of those inside these servers, and what it does is now it offloads all graphical processing to the GPU. So it's pretty cool, although it got me in trouble when I tried to expense one of these things, because my person is saying, what are you expensing a $2,000 video board to play games on a system? I said, no, it's for my server. Yeah. So it's a graphical processor board. I'll talk about some of the different specs and different models that are out there. There's a question there?
I'm just curious. Does that mean it doesn't use the GPU on the server at all?
So the question is does it not use the GPU on the server itself? It uses the GPU on the server for basic Windows graphics screens and displays and things of that type, but anything that actually goes out and does a video call, like an API video call, which might be something as simple as a Silverlight or a Flash type video, definitely anything that's using full motion video, it will call the GPU board.
So it's processing that in the kernel of the Hyper-V host server?
So it is processing all of the graphics in the, on the graphics board. It's offloading it to the GPU that's in the slot board instead of on the motherboard. Completely leaving the motherboard CPU just handle normal read-write tasks, network I/O tasks, and things of that type. I'll talk a little bit more about 5 slides from here on the graphical processing pieces. So that's the key to it, is that it basically allows the applications to run at full speed on the host because I'm not slowing it down based on graphical reasons. All screen changes, all codecs, and all the other stuff gets thrown up to the GPU board. And so from that basis, difference between Windows 2008 R2 versus 2008 R2 SP1 is 2008 R2 SP1 offloads it off for the VDI guest session. So kind of show you what that looks like. So in this particular demo, I'm going to show you using my fancy-dancy Verizon wireless card. I'm going to give you the slowest experience possible off of using 3G for this guest session. As I'm going to go through and access a remote guest session. So this is now going to use a Windows 7 VDI guest session, and let me run a full motion video on the system. So this is full motion video graphics. It's taking all of that graphical information, it's throwing it up to the GPU board that's sitting on a server. I couldn't bring the server in because the server is a big old honking server. The video board on this thing is a 2-slot board, but you'll see from the video, I can even expand the video size. So, we've been able to even do it across any type of long distances, things that where you normally have high latency. So we have offices in other locations. So I have an office and users coming in from Asia, as well as for users coming in from Europe. Now, even with 10 or 15 hops, 150, 200 millisecond latency, where you normally get really bad just day-to-day graphical performance, let alone trying to do full motion video, by being able to compress this information, do all the offloading, and stream the information over a VDI guest session, we're now able to do full motion video in remote locations. So when we were playing with this thing early on in the early adopter, I loaded up a bunch of videos onto my terminal server, and I was able to sit in a hotel room halfway around the world and actually watch full motion videos in high definition off of terminal services. When you look at the CPU load on the server itself, we were able to push it up to about 25 simultaneous users running full motion video in different parts of the world simultaneously, and we're only taking that server up to about 60, 63% utilization. Yeah.
In terms of bandwidth, what are we talking about? What's the hit compared to like standard RTP session?
Yeah, so in the way of bandwidth, and what's it affect in the way of a typical RDP session? So what you'll find within the session is that the VDI does not change the RDP transmission. So you have a certain amount of overhead for RDP that you normally have. What it's doing is for any of the graphical stuff, if you ever look at a guest session that's running graphics in a remote desktop services session, is that you end up having 5 times to 8 times more traffic through that RDS guest session. What this is able to do is any of the graphical stuff, it keeps it at the same bandwidth. So in comparisons, normal VDI or RDS guest session, one where that's not optimized is going to just suck up a lot of bandwidth, and that's why you get a very jerky experience. When I put in RemoteFX, that exact same full motion video is just like if the user was just using Word or Excel or something. And so performance-wise, if you had bad performance before, you're not going to get better performance. So it's not taking your remote desktop protocol and making it better. It's basically taking anything that becomes worse, such as the full motion video, and gives it back to you at the same performance aspects that you had. There are some third-party products that are available that will optimize that RDS stream, and I'll talk about those in a bit here as well. So RemoteFX, operating system requirements. So the VDI host itself has to be a Windows 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 server. So that means my Hyper-V host has to be SP1, standard enterprise data center, what have you. The virtual guest session, so where I talked about generic VDI, I can use an XP guest session, or I can use a Windows 7 guest session. If I'm doing VDI with RemoteFX, my guest session has to be either a 32-bit or 64-bit Windows 7, Enterprise Edition, or Ultimate Edition with Service Pack 1. So that's a requirement of RemoteFX. Again, if I just want to do straight VDI, I can use XP, I can use Home Edition, I can use Windows 7, Vista, whatever. So this is only for the RemoteFX piece that I have to have at least Enterprise or higher, Service Pack 1 for the system. And then the remote device, to be able to run RemoteFX, needs to be a system that's either running Windows 7 with Service Pack 1 or has RDP 7.1 or higher on the client piece. So if you have an old Wise terminal, is that you'll get RDP, but you're not getting RDP 7.1 that does the streaming. And again, this is specifically around RemoteFX to be able to do the streaming. It uses a different RDP client that does all the streaming and the protocol that transfers the information back and forth. In that Hyper-V host server that's running your VDI guest, it needs to be a server that supports SLAT-capable CPU. So this is typically a server that's running like an i7 or an i9 processor, something that's in the newer technologies. It won't run some of the stuff that was 3 years old or 4 years old. It requires a PCIe slot. For most of these boards, from ATI, for NVIDIA, these are boards that, they're big old boards. I mean, they're full-length cards. They have a PCI slot on there, and it's not just a generic PCI slot. It's a PCIe that also has this little extension on it, so that actually plugs into the motherboard. It also has a heat sink on this thing that rivals that of your Intel processor. The thing is that big, typically, as a heat sink and a fan. And so when you put one of those things inside a system, it typically won't fit inside a slim 2U size server. You need effectively a full case server to plug the PCI card in with this little companion card with a little heat sink and the fan. It's a big old thing. There are new motherboards and new processors that are systems that are coming out, and new video cards that a lot of these video vendors, and I saw quite a few of them. If you actually go into your little tech ed guide, it talks about some of the new RemoteFX vendors that are out on the floor. There's about 10 different vendors that are showing their RemoteFX technologies. And so what we'll find is that these boards will get thinner. The boards will actually be integrated into motherboards. But as of 2 months ago, 3 months ago, it's an add-in board. It's a gaming board. So you need a server that supports it. And IBM and Dell and HP all have equivalent servers, as well as ATI and NVIDIA has cards. What you'll find when you go into terminal services, when you go into Hyper-V, is a Hyper-V will now have, in addition to your typical processor and memory and floppy drive and COM ports and network adapters and things of that type, is that there's this thing called a RemoteFX video card. Standard video is the standard virtual video adapter that you have in the system, and this RemoteFX gives you the ability of what you want to be able to drive. It also gives you the ability to support multiple monitors and higher resolutions, 1920 by 1200 resolution. And I could do 2 monitors, 4 monitors. And so we've actually have gone into environments where we're actually doing displays. 4 displays up on a screen, or 2 displays for an airport, as this is one example that we have, where they're doing full motion video, but it's all VDI sessions. So that way they're effectively VDI guest sessions that are running. They're running multiple monitors to display different graphics up on screen. So some pretty cool stuff that you can do when you talk about virtual sessions that no longer require you to have a full-blown system dedicated. So a lot of these kiosks that used to have a big 50-inch screen with a computer inside of it, now it's a 50-inch screen with a dumb terminal that goes back out and VDIs back out to a host. So if we ever need to reboot a system, we ever need to monitor it, we're just monitoring systems that are in a data center. It shows you the GPU information. So in this case here, it basically shows me how much memory that each one of these guest sessions are running. So this particular NVIDIA card is running about a half a gig of memory. It's how much memory that's inside each one of these video cards. So when you go out and buy a gaming card, a $700 card is going to have about a gig of RAM in it. A $2,000 card is going to have about 4 gigs of RAM. And then some of the bigger cards that you start spending about $3,000, $3,500 for has 8 gigs of RAM. And each one of these guest sessions requires RAM in that video card to cache the memory. So it's one of the things to be able to take a look at. You won't be able to push typically more than about 12 to 16 VDI RemoteFX guest sessions per server, not because of the CPU performance of the motherboard, but the video cards that you get today are limited at about 4 or 8 gigabytes because most of the gaming cards are meant for a single person doing Halo, not for 10 or 20 or 50 people trying to run a RemoteFX. And again, the cards are being improved as time goes on. Another thing that you can do in RemoteFX is USB device support. So again, because I'm now running a Windows 7 guest session, and I now want to be able to run, say for example, audio for 2-way audio. Terminal services as well as VDI has always supported 1-way audio, so I can actually listen to something remotely. But I've never been able to put a microphone in there. I've never been able to go through and do link or OCS 2-way audio communications. Now with the new RemoteFX is I can now turn on USB devices, and I can actually do 2-way client support for communications. So couple last sections here. One, real-world case scenarios, where this thing whole fits in and where the different applications fit. So remote VDI for specialized traditional RDS Citrix clients. As I mentioned, the common use that we use for any type of VDI is if I can't do it in terminal services, then I'm going to go through and set up a VDI guest session. So this might be something that requires a 32-bit guest session. It might be something that I'm using where I want dedicated security. So 90%, 95% of my users can hit a terminal server no problem. They can run one-to-many. They're all using Word and Outlook and Excel and generic versions of applications. I'm just going to use a RDS server, but I got 3 people in accounting or HR that I need very specialized environments. In that case there, I'm just going to set it up as a VDI for those 3 users. Set up one gateway. Everybody goes this way except for the 3 users that go this way and hit the personal desktop configurations. So in that particular case, redirections for those users. Second scenario that we've been using this for is for USB redirection. If we have very specialized voice, we actually set this up for an organization that had call centers. They had 7 call centers, 32 users in each call center. The call centers were around the clock, so they only had 2 call centers in every region that was up. And so what we would do is every 8 hours, we'd switch call centers across. And so this was an example where we had effectively enough guest sessions to support 50 users simultaneously in every one of the 3 different time zones. And because I could do USB redirection, and I could do this pooled access that I have now 100 people accessing 30 sessions at any one time, we're able to put headsets on there, redirect the remote headsets, and now anytime that this call center would take calls, I'm using VDI. The people had nothing more than just very simple, dumb systems on their desktops with a headset, and they're able to get access to the communications anywhere in the world and direct access. Another way that we're able to do it is through, for Department of Defense contractors, where users are not allowed to bring in laptops, they're not allowed to bring in mobile phones, they're not allowed to bring in their own devices. We're able to set up VDI, provide that secured guest session for each employee, lock their system down, provide dedicated access with controls and maintain the security for those users. And then in the case of the full motion video, one of the scenarios we used it for, again, I have employees all around the world at any one time, is that we do training sessions for employees every month. We videotape these sessions, and the way we used to do it, we'd videotape the session, the person watches it offline. What we're able to do with RemoteFX, and this goes back about 2.5 years now, that we were on the early adopters for Service Pack 1, is we were able to actually set up a camera, stream full motion video through VDI guest session, and so these people were sitting in Europe, in Asia, sitting in effectively their VDI Windows 7 session, watching a full motion, full-size screen of a session that we're running, 2-way audio, so we're able to have them provide input. And if you've ever done like a room-size video conference, if you've ever tried to do it on Link, you get that little postage stamp thing, you can't see a screen, you can't see a whiteboard, you kind of see the little bits of information, unless you go out and spend $10,000, $20,000 for a life-size, full-motion video with dedicated pipe. I'm a small business. I'm not going to go out and spend $20,000, $30,000 for a remote session, but here we're able to set up effectively one Hyper-V server, VDI guest sessions, put a Sony camera on the thing, plug in the camera right into the system, and I'm now able to stream video throughout the entire environment for video conferencing and video access at basically high-definition rates. So last section, just on some configuration tips, things that you can go through and do configurations for settings. A lot of organizations want to lock down the USB redirection piece, and so here's effectively the registry setting that you can go through and shut down the USB redirection. Some organizations don't want USB redirection where somebody can plug in, say, for example, an iPhone or an iPad and do 2-way sync for iTunes. It's great because you can actually do 2-way sync with iTunes and you can bring down your content, but if you want to prevent that, 2 things that you could do within this remote desktop USB redirection is I could prevent USB sync at all, or the other thing is I can actually go through and specify by make, model, and brand a device. So I could say I will allow you to do a USB mouse, a USB headset, but not use anything from Apple, which might be an iTunes type of thing. So you can actually go through and specify not only on or off, but also for remote redirection, the vendor or the product that I want to be able to go through and prevent, such as an iPhone or an iPad type sync. I can also set up the virtual machine for redirection for enable complete access. So one of them was for redirection for partial. One of them is for full shutdown. Do not allow any plug-and-play device. And then setting up some more granular control. Some of the things that you can do, set up different classes, messages, timing, sequencing, preventing access. And so these are all device installation requirements that we can list. And then this last slide that I have here gets into that whole idea of PowerShell. This is actually a pretty cool script that allows you to turn on any Hyper-V guest sessions. I posted it up on my blog. Actually, I have a whole ton of stuff on my blog. So if you go to networkworld.com/community/Morimoto, I actually give you the full script in a text format that you can actually cut and paste. But what this will do is allow you to actually name your Hyper-V guest sessions, turn them all on, turn them all off, pause them. So at the end of today's session, instead of having me go through right-click, shut down, right-click, shut down, right-click, shut down, I run actually just a batch file. The batch file runs through this PowerShell script and boom, turns off all of my guest sessions. When I walked in a few moments ago, I went through, ran a PowerShell script and turned on all of my guest sessions in the right sequence. Some of the stuff I want the Active Directory session to start, I hit the space bar, the rest of the guest sessions start after that. So I've given you a handful of different scripts that you can use. In the VDI world, we set it up so that every night a schedule goes off and turns down all the VDI guest sessions at night.